Good afternoon, and welcome to Never Is Now, ADL's signature summit on anti-Semitism and hate. I am pleased to be the moderator for this important discussion about unity in the face of anti-Semitism. I'm honored to be here today with an incredible group of Jewish leaders representing the various religious movements to discuss how anti-Semitism is affecting our communities and how we can find common ground to take action and fight hate together. Earlier this year, ADL released results of a survey which found that the American Jewish community continues to face significant fear and anxiety from the threat of anti-Semitic or other hateful acts. In fact, the report released in March showed that 40% of Jewish Americans heard anti-Semitic comments, slurs, or threats directed at someone else over the last 12 months. And close to 63% stated that they experienced or witnessed some form of anti-Semitic incident in person. I'd now like to welcome our panelists. Welcome to Rabbi Jeffrey Meyers from the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Rabbi Jacqueline Mates-Mushin from Temple Sinai in Oakland, California. Nathan Diamond, the Executive Director for Public Policy for the Orthodox Union, and Rabbi Moti Seligson, the Director of Media Relations at Chabad Lubavitch. You can learn more about each of our speakers on the speakers page of our website. And just as a quick reminder to our attendees, you can ask questions by clicking on the Q&A button to the right of the video. Please type any questions throughout the panel, and we will try to select a few to ask the panelists after the initial discussion is complete. Welcome to my panelists. Anti-Semitic incidents have many manifestations, but their impact we know can be felt by the entire Jewish community. So I'd really like to start this discussion off today by looking at the different ways that we've seen anti-Semitism over the past few years and the responses to them. So first, I'd like to talk with Rabbi Jeffrey Meyers. 3 years ago, your community faced the deadliest anti-Semitic attack in U.S. history, and our hearts continue to be with you, Pittsburgh, and the entire Tree of Life community. So I'd like to ask, what have you seen over the past 3 years and how your community has responded? And what advice did you give to help heal and continue the fight against anti-Semitism?
Thank you, Meredith, and thank you for the privilege of being on this panel. The uniqueness of the situation in Pittsburgh is the fact that because this never happened to a synagogue ever in the history of the United States, and we've been here over 350 years, there's no playbook. There was no rabbi I could call to say, what did you do? I couldn't read the thoughts of any predecessors. We had to sort of invent, create, go with our best senses at the time of how to respond. What are the things to do? What I think I'm most proud of is the fact that here in Pittsburgh, it wasn't a singular Jewish event. It was an attack upon all of Pittsburgh. And I say that not from my own perspective, but from the words and deeds of fellow citizens here in Pittsburgh, that they surrounded us with love, that they were there every minute of every day, inquiring what our needs are. Literally every house of worship in the greater Pittsburgh area reached out. What do you need? How can we help? Funds were raised through different channels, through the Islamic Center, through the Diocese of Pittsburgh, through the Sikh Temple. Black preachers reached out to me. So an entire community just opened their doors and say, what can we do? How can we help? I can't tell you if that's unique to Pittsburgh alone because I live in Pittsburgh, but I can say that from what I've come to learn, that is what Pittsburgh is about. Those doors have remained open. And our response has been to continue to grow partnerships with various faith communities, people of different color, people of different sexual orientations, because an attack upon one is an attack upon all, as we've heard regularly. We'll be hearing it throughout this gathering. So we're finding ways to work together to recognize that our commonalities are far greater than our dissimilarities. We take our commonalities to work together to recognize that when you attack Jews because of anti-Semitism, it's also likely that you're going to attack another minority group in a city because of whom they are or what they stand for. So we take the fact that we're minorities. When we gather together, we suddenly discover there are far more minorities and they make the majority. So therefore, it's a majority of good, decent people working together to improve the quality of life, not just here in Pittsburgh, but around the country. Yes, there's a lot of work to do, but it's that sort of gathering of commonalities amongst our neighbors, because I live in Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. His house is 6 blocks from my house. We take the goodness of our neighbors. We work together, because alone, the Jewish community can't solve anti-Semitism. And quite frankly, it's not our job as the victims to fix the illness of others. It's the others who must fix it. But we're here to work to help solve the other problems.
Thank you, Rabbi Meyers. I'd next like to go to Rabbi Meyers. So as our audience knows, ADL puts out an audit of anti-Semitic incidents, and our 2020 audit reported there were about 1,242 incidents of anti-Semitic harassment. That's about 10% up from 2019. So could you please just share some creative ways that you've seen your community responding to anti-Semitism, particularly to incidents of harassment?
Thank you so much. And I want to say that I am honored to participate today and humbled to be on this panel with such distinguished colleagues. And I do appreciate at the beginning, Meredith, that you said that there are many manifestations of anti-Semitism, and just want to recognize, Rabbi Meyers, that what you and your community experience stands in a category on its own. And as much as we're going to be talking about the impact of anti-Semitism, I want to be deeply respectful of the differences of that impact on individuals as well as on communities. So my own community had our first anti-Semitic incident in 2017. On Rosh Hashanah morning, we discovered that someone had spray painted "F-U, Jewish Nazis" on the outside of the wall of our sanctuary. We believe this was the first anti-Semitic incident on our building that anyone in our community can remember, and we have members that go back generations to the congregation's founding in 1875, and so it felt very significant. I wanted to let my congregation know, but clearly I didn't want those words to greet them. So I took a huge piece of butcher paper and covered what had been written and supplied a bunch of markers and crayons. I emailed and put on Facebook to the entire congregation what had happened and asked them to come early for services so that they could write words of love and compassion and peace over the words of hate. So congregants came and wrote beautiful things. And we also found that our neighbors in the city of Oakland, as well as other faith communities, also came down to write words of love and of support. And after the butcher paper came down, we continued to have posters posted on our doors of those same words of support and of kindness and of love. In addition to inviting people to write words of love and positivity, I also called the media, which isn't always recommended in cases of vandalism. But in this case, not only was anti-Semitic vandalism on Rosh Hashanah newsworthy, but we wanted to share what we did in response. And that enabled us to present ourselves as a community focused on kindness and compassion. It was empowering to members of my community. We had a way to respond to the incident and show ourselves, as well as others, that we are people who work against hate by reiterating the need for goodness. So finding a way to empower the members of our community when we might otherwise feel helpless is crucial. And another important response to anti-Semitism, as Rabbi Meyers was just saying, is to fight hate wherever we see it and to stand with others who are also targeted minorities. Because hate is hate, and we know that at any moment, any minority can be the target, and at some point we all will be. So fighting hate in any direction also fights anti-Semitism. And in combating hate in general, we often find that the people we stand with will want to stand with us. So when Oakland Chinatown was an early hotbed for violence and hate crimes against Asian Americans, especially the elderly, we wanted to do something. And we wound up raising significant funds to help create a system of cameras and monitoring in Oakland Chinatown, hoping the cameras would be both a deterrent, but also a message to the people who lived and worked in Chinatown that they have a greater community who supports them. A couple of weeks ago, when our local CRC held an event to raise awareness of the rise in anti-Semitism, representatives who we engaged with and who we partnered with from the Chinese community asked to speak publicly in support of us. Through the Religious Action Center, the social action branch of the Reform Movement, we do a lot of organizing and coalition building with organizations and groups who fight hate and discrimination in all forms. So, for example, last year we had a voting rights campaign and worked with organizations who represented groups that are traditionally targeted for voter suppression. And in California, we work with our officials and groups on issues such as equity and education and how to create more affordable housing and ways we can reform our social, or rather our criminal justice system. So our partners in this work value our partnership and our support for those who are most vulnerable in society. And our partners stood up for us when we became vulnerable. So we worked with Tony Thurmond, who had been an assembly member representing the district where my congregation lives, and the legislation that he brought to the assembly. When he became the superintendent of public instruction for the state of California, he spoke in support of us against a problematic ethnic studies curriculum that was introduced a few years ago. For those who may not know, the initial draft of the document was not only devoid of any mention of the existence of anti-Semitism, as well as lacking reference to a number of other ethnic groups, but it presented anti-Semitic perspectives, like calling the founding of Israel the Nakba, and stated that BDS is a global social movement that currently aims to establish freedom for Palestinians living under apartheid conditions as a fact, rather than as a controversial movement with many, including California state agencies and departments, who oppose it. The superintendent's voice was critical in combating not only the curriculum, but the view that Jews are perpetrators and oppressors. He spoke unequivocally about the need to include Jews as a historically targeted minority and was essential in ensuring that the curriculum included the American Jewish experience and took out the bias against Israel. So finding ways to empower ourselves when things happen, when we feel helpless, is an important way to respond to anti-Semitism. And proactively standing up against hate of all kinds, wherever we see it, is crucial to combating anti-Semitism as well.
Thank you, Rabbi. So important for us to remember, ADL has a dual mission of fighting the defamation of the Jewish people, but also securing justice and fair treatment for all. And it's so important, not just to be a bystander, to be an upstander, and for us as a collective community to come together to fight hate. So I'd kind of like to shift the focus a little bit. And Nathan, I'd like to talk with you. So a recent report revealed that more than half, about 59% of Jewish Americans polled, said they felt less safe in the United States than they were a decade ago. Now, you work in the advocacy space, which is just so crucial to the work that we do. So what are some of the challenges and the successes that you've seen in response to anti-Semitism over the past few years?
Thank you for that question, Meredith. And let me also thank ADL for inviting me to this important conference. And I'm honored to be with my fellow presenters and esteemed leaders. The challenges, in a certain sense, pick up where Rabbi Meyers almost left off, which is at an ADL conference, we're all aware of and focused on the not only the existence of anti-Semitism, but the increase in anti-Semitism that sadly we're confronting in the United States and also around the world. But perhaps the biggest challenge is there are still people who think in various ways that it doesn't exist, or it's minimized, or they don't understand what anti-Semitism is. And the fact that in the case of California, as she described, people were able to present a curriculum that had so much anti-Semitic content in it, in the first place, that could be presented in the first place is a challenge. The fact that this conference had to kick off last night with the Vice President of the United States, Kamala Harris, making a clear declaration and unequivocal statement about the nature of anti-Semitism right now in our time. The fact that that has to be said and has to be declared and taught to people who are tuning in is a testament to the fact that, unfortunately, there's a lot of ignorance about anti-Semitism and a lot of misunderstanding about anti-Semitism. And that's probably the biggest challenge across the board. I would also say that for the Orthodox segment of the Jewish community, there's another layer of challenge, which is, there are things that can go on which are in fact anti-Semitic or anti-Orthodox anti-Semitic that uniquely target the Orthodox or observant segments of the Jewish community. The way that zoning laws can be used to target the growth or to try to impede the growth of communities of Jews who are Sabbath observant and need to be within walking distance of their synagogues on Shabbat, or various measures that can target the production or distribution of kosher food, or Brit Milah for that matter. Some of which are particularly unique to the Orthodox community, some of which extend beyond the Orthodox community to other segments of the observant Jewish community. So that's another level of education and information at best that needs to go on for us to be able to effectively combat these different forms and these different layers of anti-Semitism. In terms of, you also asked about successes. I'm glad, so I don't have to paint an entirely bleak picture. And I would say again, to pick up where Rabbi Meyers touched on as well. There are coalitions of the willing, coalitions of goodwill in combating hate across the board, and particularly, we've built coalitions with very, I would say, small c conservative and traditionalist elements of other faith communities, be it evangelical Christians or traditional Muslim communities and others who have a common understanding of deeply embedded religious practices, that are not well known and not as popularly disseminated through the media or other parts of American society, so that they too are fighting ignorance about their religious observances and rights and practices and their needs. And there are people of goodwill who we've been able to build coalitions with across, as I say, different faith communities that are traditionalist and conservative, and also people of goodwill beyond that in more liberal and pluralistic segments of those communities as well. So the successes have come through coalition building and an expanded understanding that we all need to fight hate together.
Thank you, Nathan. And I think that even stresses something. Just the other day, the Orthodox Union, ADL, and a few others came together to make sure that Deborah Lipstadt is confirmed. And that is certainly something that I think shows how our communities can work together. So I want to shift again to Rabbi Moti Seligson. So we've seen a consistent reporting of anti-Semitism on our college campuses in K through 12 schools. And in fact, there was a recent survey about college students conducted that found about 32% of our Jewish students experience anti-Semitism directed at them. And we've talked about the different ways anti-Semitism has manifested, but I want to talk about a proactive approach in regards to anti-Semitism. What can we do? So, of course, we're always going to call it anti-Semitism wherever we see it and react appropriately. But how can we at the same time build relationships, look to the human element of what might be causing hate in our communities? How can we shift our focus a little bit, not just the reacting, but in a proactive way in our communities?
Thank you, Meredith. And thank you to the ADL for putting on this important summit and inviting me here. As Rabbis Meyers and Mushin pointed out, the opposite of hate is love and respect. And while it's critical that we respond to hate forcefully and educate, especially young people, about the dangers of hatred and divisiveness, we really need to find a positive way, an inspiring way to inoculate, especially young people, against hate, and as opposed to just reacting or focusing just on hatred itself. If we were to be able to impart a sense of purpose in life and teach young people about the God-given talents that they have and their unique opportunity to change the world, or their unique role in the world. And if they were to understand that every individual brings something unique to that shared mission of society and making this world a better place, they would see differences with other people, not as something negative, not as something to hate them for, but as something to embrace them for, see them as allies. And this is really something that we could enlist parents to do, to talk to their children about what their purpose is and what their reason in this world is. And when in recent years, actually, the Lubavitcher Rebbe launched a campaign to do just this, to encourage parents to talk to their children and for schools to give a quiet moment at the beginning of the day to think about this. And when we were, if we're approaching this from a positive perspective, as opposed to a reactive perspective, I think we would be dealing with a lot less of these issues. It's not to say that the education around hate isn't important. It's obviously critical, and responding to incidents are critical. But if we were able to start from the beginning that and deal with these in a preventative measure, we would be in a much better place than we are today. And it's something that's doable if we were to focus on it.
Thank you, Rabbi. So I want to shift. I'm going to go back to you, Rabbi Mates-Mushin. So, we're all here from the different denominations, from the different movements and stuff. What do you see as a way where we can all come together? We've talked about in the advocacy space, we've certainly talked about, Rabbi Meyers mentioned, the different communities coming together to support them. What are other things you think that the different Jewish movements can work together? We all come to it from different perspectives sometimes, but what are some things that you think we can be doing collectively? Because part of the panel is unity today. And what are some things that we can be doing that you think have been successful, maybe things that we can even be doing better?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I do think that historically, and it continues today, that when there are issues and when there is violence against the Jewish community, that the Jewish community as a whole is pretty good at coming together and working together. It's those times in between where I think we have a much more difficult time, where we are often judgmental and where we kind of separate ourselves from each other. And I'm wondering if we are also able to build some of those relationships in the times that we're not just combating or not only combating the folks who are against us, but recognizing that we're all in this together at all times and finding ways to connect and to come together. And, we've seen it in ways of, shared study sessions or shared ways to celebrate holidays or those kinds of things. And I think that within the Oakland community, those have been very positive ways to build those kinds of connections that only then make our support for each other and our strength as a community that much more so when difficult things happen too.
Great, thank you. So I want to shift the focus back to Nathan. So you talked about, legislative and advocacy. So what are some of the new legislative initiatives that you see, whether it's currently before Congress, at the state level, at the local level? What are some of the initiatives that the different Jewish movements can also come together to support? What are some things you see on the horizon coming up?
Well, things that are right now on the table that we at the OU are involved in, and I would say I know we're in coalition on some of these with ADL and other groups in the Jewish community like Jewish federations and also groups beyond the Jewish community. Two pieces of pending legislation include one is called the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act. And another is the Pray Safe Act. Without going into too much of the minutia, the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act is designed to give new and additional resources to the FBI and Department of Homeland Security to work even more closely with local law enforcement agencies to combat hate crimes in a variety of ways. Right, and that is a bipartisan bill, and another one that we particularly worked on is as I mentioned, the Pray Safe Act, which is designed to bring resources and create a new center of best practices and shared resources to the Department of Homeland Security, with a particular focus on helping synagogues and churches and mosques and other houses of worship improve their security, because sadly, we've lived through a period of time where not only did we have the first terribly tragic assault on a Jewish synagogue in the case of Pittsburgh, but we've seen churches and mosques and Sikh temples and others in various places around the country over the past decade or two also become targets of violence and hate. And sadly, but necessarily, we need to really make sure that houses of worship in the United States are really safe spaces for people to exercise that fundamental freedom. Those are some specific things that are on the table. I would say the other thing that we're trying to galvanize at the OU Advocacy Center in partnership with local communities is to try to have a more consistent amount of protection provided by local police and law enforcement across the board. In large communities like New York and some others where they're familiar with the Jewish communities, the local police departments are pretty good about that. But in other communities where there's less familiarity and frankly oftentimes fewer resources, the level of protection is not quite there, and we find the community has to bear a significant cost to have the appropriate level of protection. And I think that's something that, again, a lot of communities within the Jewish community and beyond can come together and ask for from their local governments, who are meant to be responsive to them, to provide that measure of protection for people gathering and exercising their fundamental freedoms.
So that brings up an interesting question that I'd actually like to pose to all of the panelists. So we're getting a couple of questions from the audience, and we mentioned, there is a heightened state of anti-Semitism, and there are people in the community who are afraid to go out and wear their Jewish star or wear a kippah, or to appear visibly Jewish is the way the question was phrased. So what is the advice that you are giving to the community? Because we don't want people to be afraid. We want them to be who they are. I want to be able to walk to shul and feel comfortable that I'm not going to be targeted. What are some things that you are doing to tell people to be proud of who they are, to continue to, express your Judaism? What are you seeing within your communities? And it may differ depending on where you are. So Rabbi Meyers, why don't we go to you first, just to kind of talk about this a little bit.
Thank you. Well, we're talking about domestic terrorists. We're talking about bullies. And throughout the course of history, we've always faced bullies like this who want to quiet us down, want to send us back into the basements that the Marranos hid in and practice their Judaism in secret. My mantra has become, the more anti-Semitism, the more we do Jewish. The answer is not to do less and to cower, because then you give them a victory, which is what they want, and empowers them even more. So I've spoken of, for example, when we had an anti-Semitism rally a number of months ago at Pittsburgh at City Hall, that if you don't light Shabbat candles yet, let's help you get a set of candlesticks and a set of candles. Proudly light the candles. Be proud to be Jewish. The coming of Hanukkah is a perfect example where Persum Hanes, we're supposed to take the menorah, put it in your window, and proudly show that you're Jewish. We need to find opportunities where people can feel that they are safe, but yet they can proudly show that they're Jewish and be able to proclaim that to the rest of the world and not hide in fear of the anti-Semites, because that's what the anti-Semites want. A perfect example was in Billings, Montana. Some of you may recall the story many years ago when the neo-Nazi party was terrorizing the community there, and then threw, I think, a brick or something through a glass window of the one Jewish family who had a menorah there. And they made, I believe it was photocopies of the menorah, and everyone put it in their windows, 10,000 residents. The neo-Nazi party left Billings, Montana because of that. So when we find partners and we rise up together to support each other, be proud to be Jewish. Don't hide in your basement. Of course, be intelligent, be safe, be smart, work with others, but nonetheless, be proud, do more Jewish, I think is the answer.
Beautiful, thank you. So Rabbi Seligson, I want to come to you on that, but add a little bit of a twist. So We also were asking, so what does our faith teach us about fighting hate? Are there any verses or pieces of Torah that keep us inspired and committed to do this work? We know this is hard work. We know we want to eradicate hate, but what does our faith really teach us about this?
Well, there's you don't have to look much further than today's Torah portion, where it starts off where Yaakov, it says he raised his feet, and Rashi explains that that's a reference to his assurances that he received from God, that he's gonna build a great nation. And the Lubavitcher Rebbe would cite that as for this very topic, that when we know that um, we're going to be successful and we're on the side of light and goodness, we should have all the confidence in the world. And what Rabbi Meyers said is exactly spot on. If the way we fight hate is with light, and the way that we fight anti-Jewish hate is by being more Jewish. And if this Hanukkah, every Jew had a menorah outside their window, that's something that creates a huge amount of light and confidence. And it's not just about us. It's not just about the confidence that it instills within each of us. It's a way of creating respect from other people, and it actually changes the reality. And we should be engaging with the rest of the world beyond just the Jewish community in a meaningful way, in a purposeful way. A few years ago, there was an incident where some high school kids were playing some kind of game, and there were photos circulated of them wearing uh, clothing with anti-Semitic symbols in it, and the local Chabad rabbi, instead of just condemning it, actually went to that young person's home, knocked on their door. Fast forward a few years later, he became a mentor to this family, and really helped turn this young person's life around by encouraging him to do good and instilling a sense of purpose and meaning in everything, as opposed to just responding to the negativity.
Great, thank you. So we're getting some questions now, actually similar to that. So Rabbi Meitzmushin, I want to go back to you for a minute. So a lot of people, talk about, the opposite of hate is not love, but indifference. This is the way the question is phrased. So what have you found, I think, is the best way to engage in a respectful and civil conversation when we know the anti-Semitic incident might be coming from a place of a lack of understanding? That kind of maybe expands a little bit on what Rabbi Seligson was talking about. How can we, continue to look at apathy also when it is affecting hate? So if you could just kind of talk a little bit about that, what you're seeing in your community.
Yeah, I mean, as we talk, the folks that I'm really thinking about are our youth and our teens, and that everything that was happening in May, right, the violence between Israel and Gaza, and the kinds of things that were being put out on social media, and the way that our teens were feeling very targeted and very much alone. That one of the ways that I think helped to support them and to help them figure out how they engage with their friends and their acquaintances was to be sure that they knew that they were not alone. And this speaks to both what Rabbi Meyers and Rabbi Seligson are talking about, is to in a community of Jews as well, recognize the organizations and the communities that are here to support each other and to think together about what the solutions are. Every situation is nuanced enough that there is no one way to say this is how we combat it, this is what you should say, this is what you should do. But in reaching out to each other and thinking together and supporting each other, I do think that there's ways that we can figure out together how to approach whether it's a specific community, whether it's a specific school, or help individuals approach their friends and their acquaintances about the things that have been difficult and hateful and hurtful.
Thank you. And I do want to note ADL has an incredible guide about conscientious conversations, how to have respectful dialogue within your schools, within your workplaces, with just your family sometimes too, which we know for everybody can sometimes be a challenge. So with that, Nathan, I want to kind of shift back to you a little bit in the advocacy space. So we know the past few years, there's been a lot of political silos in ADL where, we work bipartisan, we work with our legislators just like the OU does. But how do we build bridges? How do we work together with people? What are you seeing within the community, in the advocacy space in particular, with getting both sides to condemn anti-Semitism, to work with the different Jewish movements that are out there?
Look, I think the good news is that in both political parties, there are far more people, including politicians, of goodwill than those on the fringes, who, let's just say, it's very difficult to have a conversation with, and there it's very possible to build bridges, and find common ground initiatives. The pieces of legislation I mentioned previously are bipartisan. Our efforts to get the legislation passed. You mentioned Deborah Lipstadt, who's nominated to be the State Department envoy to combat anti-Semitism. The legislation we worked on together with ADL and others to have that position elevated to the rank of an ambassador was bipartisan legislation and passed overwhelmingly. So there are places to find bipartisan coalitions and build common ground and try to marginalize those who are really at the extremes and again, to say it nicely, are hard to have a conversation with. I think what's important to underscore, this goes back to the earlier point that you made and that Rabbi Meyers and the others responded to, is that even in this climate that we're in right now in the United States, where there are more incidents, people are more fearful. The phrase you hear sometimes, people ask you, "Oh, is this Germany in the early 1930s?" People really ask that question, and we Jews have a very deep historical memory, so it's not surprising that we're asking that question. But it remains the case that there's a fundamental difference between the United States and previous societies in which Jews lived and had difficulties in, and that is, again, you had the Vice President of the United States open this conference last night with a clear condemnation of anti-Semitism. And you've had, in response to each and every incident, leaders of both political parties and leaders of other major sectors of society, whether it's business or media or various other sectors, clearly speak out as in opposition to anti-Semitism and other forms of hate. Whereas in those previous eras, right, it was the governments and the authorities who were stoking and perpetrating the persecution of our ancestors. So we shouldn't lose the perspective that we are still in a society that is very welcoming to Jews, that embraces Jews as part of the American community, and Judaism as part of the understanding of broad American culture. And there are more potential partners in these efforts than people on the other side.
Thank you. That's an excellent point. So with that, I want to actually go to each of the panelists and pose a question. So, not everybody is affiliated in the Jewish community. So the question really is, how can we as an entire Jewish community, whether you're affiliated with a synagogue, whether you go to a JCC regularly, whether your child goes to Jewish preschool, how can we work to support each other in the fight in anti-Semitism? What are some best practices that you are seeing within your communities? You mentioned Rabbi Meyers as an example, when your synagogue faced vandalism and covering it up. What do we teach at all the different levels? We want to teach, age appropriate for our kids when they're younger about kindness. What are some things we can be doing with our teens? And honestly, what can we be doing as adults? Because sometimes it's easier with kids to talk to them about what it's being good and being kind to our neighbors and others. But sometimes as adults, it's definitely harder. So Rabbi Seligson, why don't we go to you first in this? What are some things you're seeing within the Chabad movement? What are some things that have been working? I know that Chabad has some incredible classes and things that you've been doing with the community. So I'd love to just hear your thoughts on this, and then we'll go to the other panelists.
Yeah, at the moment, we're actually, we have a course on, the title's actually Outsmarting Anti-Semitism. And the, but really it's about instilling a sense of confidence and focusing on the positive. And again, that means instilling a sense of Jewish pride, where Jews feel comfortable and understand that it's through being proud and sharing who they are publicly that we impact the world around us, and that's something that we're respected for ultimately. Beyond that, it's really connecting with all people. If we're a light onto the nations, then that means that we have a message to share, and we have something inspiring to share with others, and that's all encompassing beyond just the negative of hatred, but also how we live our lives and how we do that in a positive way, and how we're able to uplift the world around us and everyone else with it. And that's something that all of us could do. It's not something reserved for clergy. And it doesn't have to happen after something bad transpires, but it's something that we could proactively do with our neighbors and friends and people we come in contact with, and by and that's again both by living a certain way, but also by interacting with people, speaking to them, sharing with them, and we really could change the reality in our immediate area, whether it's amongst neighbors or our community, and ultimately that has incredible impact globally as well.
Thank you. Rabbi Meyers, why don't we go to you to talk a little bit about this?
Yeah, thank you. I feel like the theme of this conversation is really about partnership and reaching out to others, looking for support and giving support, offering support. I wish that I or this panel in general had magical words or actions that you could take whenever we face any kind of anti-Semitism or hate. I think every situation is nuanced. Every situation is different. The kind of anti-Semitism that comes through under the guise of protecting other minority groups is very different than, some more overt and kind of traditional anti-Semitism that we're accustomed to seeing. I think in every situation, to reach out to Jewish organizations and to Jewish leaders is essential. Reach out to the ADL, as Meredith said. The ADL is accustomed to dealing with these kinds of issues all the time and has resources. If anyone calls me as a rabbi, whether or not they belong to my congregation, I will be there to help and support you. You are not alone. You are not by yourself when something like this happens. And I don't know that there is a particular thing that any of us can give you that is an absolute way to be able to address it whenever it comes up. But I can promise you that we will work on it together and figure it out together. And that is, I think, can be a huge source of comfort, that we're not alone, that we're in this together and we can address it together.
So important. And I do want to point out, because we've gotten a couple of questions on how to report incidents. So thank you for telling people they can come to ADL. So we do have on ADL's website, if you go there, adl.org, and there is a section about reporting an incident, whether it's an anti-Semitic incident, whether it's some other form of discriminatory event, and it'll go to the different regional offices so that we can help you as an individual or your community, or if it's a school, just to navigate through the process of what needs to happen and what are the next steps. So Nathan, let's go to you next, and then to Rabbi Meyers. Just sort of this focus on wherever we are within our Judaism, whether we are somebody who is going to synagogue every weekend, whether we're somebody who the high holidays is extremely important to us, or whether it's just our kids just embracing the beauty of Judaism. What are ways that we can continue to, again, the theme is, as I think Rabbi Meyers said, partnership, unity. What are some things you think we can be doing as far as next step? The conversation can't just end today. The conversation is continuing.
Well, so I mean, I'll bring the advocacy lens to it. I think in the advocacy space, so much of what we have to do in the Jewish community really relies upon coalition building. So a synonym, I guess, to partnership, right, is coalitions. So and what's important there, and in this arena is in the advocacy space where a lot of this can come to a head. It's important for us to understand that mutual respect and protection for other communities is a two-way street, and that and if we're pursuing legislative initiatives or other things in the advocacy space, that we can build coalitions and mutual understanding by explaining to folks that might disagree with whatever our particular proposal is, why it's so important for us to be able to live our lives as American Jews, or even different parts of the American Jewish community, and that part of our identity for us is just as important as whatever part of that other community's identity they're trying to protect or advance through things that they are pursuing. So if the African American community is pursuing certain initiatives because of their lived experience, and they need certain things to be able to live secure and also flourishing lives as African Americans, we have to understand for ourselves and also be able to communicate to them what, for lack of a better phrase, we need in law and in policy and in society for us to be able to fully live Jewish lives. And I think sometimes American Jews don't have that conception of themselves where they try to explain that to other communities that they often find themselves being in coalitions or being in partnership with. That we are very dedicated to trying to be good citizens and good coalition partners for the others. And I'm saying that in the most positive sense, but sometimes we forget about ourselves, right? If I can, quote, "Imein ani li mili," right? We need to also be good advocates and good stewards of our own interests. And that's not negative. That is part of what we need to do for ourselves. But we can do it in a way that is affirming and beneficial to other parts of American society as well.
Thank you, Nathan. So important. So Rabbi Meyers, I want to just kind of expand a little bit on what we've been talking about, because while the other panelists were answering questions, a question came in about what's recently happened in Texas, and we've seen an uptick in the Austin area of some anti-Semitic incidents. And the person who posed this question said, the community is planning on coming together to demonstrate against these acts, but they're afraid to go. So what advice would you give them? I know it's kind of a hard question because it's very personal for everybody, but they're looking for some guidance. What can they be doing to speak out, but also feel safe at the same time, which we don't have, as we said, we don't have a magic answer for this, but what would you tell them as somebody who has unfortunately been through, a very difficult anti-Semitic incident?
Well, as it works out, I have been in touch with a rabbinic colleague in Austin. So I've been following closely what happens in Austin, because it seems as though my role, my calling over time has evolved from merely congregation rabbi to sort of following all of these sorts of incidents. I think the Austin community has been well supported by the government, local and state, by communities around the United States, to let them know this. It's a stark reminder that the evil of anti-Semitism is just not going to go away. There's no real inoculation for it, but yet the fascinating thing is that there is a cure. You can just choose not to be an anti-Semite. It's not a complex sort of thing. It starts at the kitchen table. It continues when parents bring their children to anti-Semitic rallies. When you grow up in an environment of that, that's all that you know. We live in silos in the United States. Like people live in like silos. We don't know our neighbors, and there are no bridges between those silos. Um, to me, education is the most critically important piece that all of my panelists have spoken on, that we don't know our neighbors. Um, when we don't know, it leads to misunderstanding, fear, loathing, eventually the H word, as I call it, and then eventually violence. Um, so in the public schools, I think we need to expand from STEM education. We went to STEAM education. I think we need to make it stream education, and R for religion. We need to learn about the other faiths of the people around us. We get to know our neighbors. When you get to know your neighbors, you discover they're just like you. They want the same things that you want. Not only should we be doing this in the public schools, we should be doing this in the colleges. We should be doing this in houses of worship throughout the United States. But in the end, most likely right now, I'm preaching to the choir, because the people listening are the good people who are doing these sorts of things. So I think the real challenge is, how do you get the word out to the people who don't want to be members of the choir? And that's all about the relationship building, the one-on-ones, and the getting to know your neighbors.
Beautiful. That I almost want to end there because that just really summarizes so much. So thank you, Rabbi Meyers. But I want to kind of just do a quick sort of round robin, just sort of last thoughts before we do some wrap ups from each of you, and really thinking about, like I said, moving forward. You know, we've talked about so much with education, so much with our teens, so much with the adults in our community. I could tout all of the incredible programs that ADL has to work with our communities and stuff. But if there was one thing, and I know this is kind of a hard question, but there's one thing you'd like to leave everybody with today, what would that be? So Rabbi Seligson, I'm going to come to you first. Everybody else has a little more time to think about it, but what is one thing that you could kind of, leave our audience with today?
I think we need to find inspiring ways to uplift people and unify them and educate them. And that those generally tend not to relate directly to hatred or bigotry or anti-Semitism, where we're not just focused on what people shouldn't be doing, but we're focusing in providing tools and the direction for what people can be doing and really should be doing.
Thank you. Nathan, why don't we go to you next, please?
I'm in response to your question. I'm moved to note that just a week or so ago we marked the first anniversary of the passing of former British Chief Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, and one of the many books that he authored in his prolific career was a book called The Dignity of Difference, and it's a like so many of his writings, it's very complex, but if I had to dare to try to distill, a core of it, a core message in that book is that what's unique about Judaism is that we don't expect all the people of the world to become Jewish. Judaism was created as a religion and as a people, and the Jewish people were created as people who were created for the purpose of observing what God had asked us to do to fulfill our mission as Jews, and to serve as, in many ways, an example or a model for other parts of global humanity. But our job is not to go out there and convert everybody to Judaism. And that, at its core, is reliant upon what Rabbi Sacks called the dignity of difference, that we are teaching that not everybody is supposed to be exactly the same, and that we need to recognize that within the Jewish community, we have diversity and difference within the Jewish community, and to recognize the dignity of difference beyond the Jewish community. And the more that we can incorporate that and appreciate that and live that within and among the Jewish community and then beyond, it seems to me to be a fundamental message that can help us in this challenge that we've been talking about in this hour.
Great, thank you. Rabbi Meyers, and then we'll go to Rabbi Meyers.
I'm struck by the Midrash referencing Adam and Eve when they're created. When the Midrash tells us that God created one of each of them to let humanity know that all of us have an original set of parents. No one has a greater set of parents than anybody else. And to me, there's a power in that teaching from the Midrash. When the Torah is telling us we're all one. Families will argue, families will disagree. That's the nature of what families are about. But in the end, we're all there for each other because we are families. But if we take that powerful teaching and say, because we all are one parent, we're all one big mishpacha. Mishpacha has to take care of each other. And at times when one family member is ill, other members of the family step in to take care of those needs. When one family member suffers a loss, God forbid, family steps in to take care of that need. When one family has a simcha, everybody celebrates together. We've lost our common humanity. We need to find good ways to reclaim that, to be able to recognize that we're so much alike, and to be able to work together so that God can look down from heaven and say, you know, I'm proud of what they're doing now. I don't know if God can say that right now as an overview. I'll leave that up to God to let us know. But I want God to be able to feel that way, that I'm proud of what humanity is accomplishing. I left you as stewards of this planet. You got a lot of work to do. Let's get working.
Thank you. And Rabbi Meyers, just the last couple of seconds we have, and then I'll do a quick wrap up.
Well, so I'd say it's in two parts. I think that anti-Semitism and acts of hate are successful when they make you feel isolated and they make you feel alone. And I think just to remember that you are not alone, not only is the Jewish community here to be of support, but as Rabbi Meyers said earlier as well, there is far more good in this world than there is evil. And so to just when you feel like those times where you're closing in on yourself, to reach out to others, and you'll find the goodness and you'll find help and support. And in that way, control what you can control and focus on that, and be a force for goodness and righteousness and kindness and compassion in this world. That's what we can control. That's what we can do. And we will, if we can, focus on those things and work in that way, we will make the world better for us as well as for so many others.
Thank you. And thank you to each of you for joining me today. You know, our discussion today really highlights the need for us to reinforce a whole of society approach to combating anti-Semitism, whether we see it on social media, on a synagogue, at a school. And we're going to continue to say that anti-Semitism has no place in our communities. And as leaders in the Jewish community, I really want to thank each of you for stepping up to ensure that each of us feel safe and empowered to express our Jewish values and to be our whole selves, no matter what. So thank you again for all of you for being here with me today. And then last, before we go, I just want to let our audience to know, please click on the full agenda at the top of the page, and you can see a full slate of all the panels from subject matter experts from around the country. We would love for you to add your voice to the conversation on social media. Tell us why you're fighting anti-Semitism and hate, and use the hashtag #NeverIsNow. You can scroll down and also find a list of ways you can take action in the fight against anti-Semitism and hate. I would also urge you, our next panel, Confronting Anti-Black Racism in the Fight Against Anti-Semitism, is at 1:30 Eastern Standard Time. This panel today was recorded, and we would love to hear your feedback. So thank you again for joining us today at ADL's Never Is Now.